Welcome back to Missionary Story. This is chapter 5. I promise at the end today I will not say, come back next time to hear what happens. We're going to end the story today. Do you remember what happened last time when that story was ending, that chapter was ending? Francis was leaving the farm. He thought if they didn't want him there, if they wished he had never come, well then he was leaving. He was on his bike, riding as quickly, as hard as he could. He rode out of the farm, across the bridge, headed into the town. But as he was riding, it occurred to him, he didn't know where he was going. Where was he going to go? He had no place to go. Well, there was his house, but Mom was still in the hospital and Dad and the girls, they had moved to Graham's. But suddenly Francis was filled with a real desire, a want to be at his own house with his own things in his own room. And so Francis headed that direction. Now he knew the house would be locked, but that wasn't a problem. A long time ago, Francis had figured out a way to get into the house when both doors were locked. So he rode his bike all the way to his house, but when he pulled into the front, he could hardly believe what he saw. No one had been taking care of the house or the lawn at all. The grass in the front yard was all grown up high. The one little flower bed that was there was all filled with weeds. And Francis saw right away that a window in the kitchen had been broken. Still, he knew how to get into the house, so he went up on the porch. He climbed up onto the railing around the porch, and then he went over to where there was a post, and he kind of shimmied up the post on the porch to the porch roof, and then he went across, carefully across the porch roof to where his bedroom window was. Now, he knew it would be locked, but these were really, really old windows, and they didn't really lock very well, and Francis knew if he just shook them a little bit, got his fingers down in there, he got the latch turned. And he opened the window and he let himself in to his bedroom. Francis couldn't believe what he saw. His room was a mess. It was a wreck. Someone had gotten into his bedroom and had wrecked everything. They had pulled out the drawers out of his dressers and had dumped them over, and things were thrown all around. Some of his comic books were torn up and his baseball cards were torn up. It looked like people had just gone across it and stomped on everything. Cars were broken, toys were broken. He couldn't believe it. Who would do this? He turned and he ran down the steps and out the back door, heading right for the cherry tree. When he got there, he reached up and he was gonna climb up, but someone was up there looking down at him. It was Ram. Ram said, "Francis, I saw you come. Come on up and I'll tell you everything." Francis climbed up and he sat down beside Ram. And Ram, he said, Ram, someone has been in the house. Someone has wrecked all of my stuff." "I know," Ram said. "I saw them." And he explained to Francis how he had seen Tyke and Spotty come into the front yard. He had seen them break the window in the kitchen. And Ram said that he had run home and he told his mother and she had called the police. Wow, Francis looked at Ram. He was kind of impressed that Ram would be brave enough to do that. And he said, "Well, what happened then?" And Ram said the police had come and they had taken Tyke and Spotty away. "Where are they now?" Francis asked. "They have gone to a school where they stay all day and all night and they never go home. The police made them go there." Francis still didn't understand why this had happened or what was he going to do, but they sat in the tree and they talked for a while together. And finally Ram said he was going to head back home for dinner, and he invited Francis to come with him to have something to eat. And so they were climbing down out of the cherry tree when a car pulled in at the house. Francis recognized it right away. It was Mrs. Glennie's car. And she jumped out and she said, "Oh, Francis, I am so glad I found you. I'm glad you're okay. Then she said, hello, Ram. And she said, now, Francis, you get into the car and we are going home together. No. Francis said, no, I'm not going back. You don't want me there. Kate said. Oh, Francis, Mrs. Glennie said, I know she said that, but she just lost her temper. She didn't really mean that. None of us feel this way. In fact, everyone in the family has been out looking for you, and they've all said they're not even going to eat until they could find you. They're going to be so glad when I bring you home. Well, Francis stopped for a minute, and deep down inside, he really did like it there at the farm. He didn't have anywhere else to go, and so he said, okay, he would go back. But then he said, but Mrs. Glennie, you have to see. Someone wrecked my room. Everything is broken. It was Tyke and Spotty, and Ram saw them. Mrs. Glennie just paused for a minute. She looked at Francis and she said, and Francis, my tulips are all broken. It was Francis, and Kate saw him. Francis just put his head down. He said, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I do that. I was just so mad. I'm sorry. And then he took Mrs. Glennie's hand. He said, come see my room. So together they went into the house and up to Francis's room. And oh, when they got up there, Mrs. Glennie saw it really was a mess. But she got down there on the floor with Francis and they began to look through his things. And they found that a lot of the things were not destroyed. A lot of them weren't broken. A lot of them hadn't been torn up. And so they began to carefully fix what they could and gather it together. And she had said that Francis could bring it with him back home to the Glennie farm. And as they were working at that, all of a sudden Mrs. Glennie looked at Francis and she said, Francis, why do you think Tyke and Spotty do things like this? Why do you think they would wreck your room? And he was ready to answer, but then she said, and why do you think you wrecked my flowers? Francis thought for a minute. He said, I guess we just must be bad, and I guess I don't try hard enough, and I guess I just need to try harder. No. Mrs. Glennie said, that's not it, Francis. She said, none of us are good enough, Francis. And then she said, it's kind of like, do you remember that spring that you found at that old shepherd's house and how it had all this clean and clear water coming out of it? But that he told you that there was a time when it was just all cluttered up with mud and dirt and stuff and only muddy water came out? He remembered that. And she said, Francis, there's sin in us. We all sin. We all do wrong things. None of us are good enough on our own. That's why we need Jesus, she said. And she said, Jesus said, Francis, whoever believes in me, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. She said, Francis, our sin is like that muddiness and that dirt. But Jesus took all that. He took our sin. When he died, they nailed him to a wooden cross. He bled and died, was buried, and came alive again. He did that. He was perfect God and perfect man. So he took all that away. Now, Francis, all we have to do is believe that he did that for us. And he fills us up with those waters and springs of goodness and love and joy. And right there, in his wrecked bedroom, Francis asked Mrs. Glennie to help him pray, to help him tell Jesus that he believed in him as God who had died for him, and that he wanted Jesus to take away all of that sin and forgive him and fill him up with those clean waters of a new kind of life. They got his things together and headed back to the farm. Everyone was glad to see him. They were so relieved he'd come back, especially Kate. They got things all straightened out. Francis was glad to be back at the farm. He loved it there, and besides, he was getting some good news. Mom was getting better, and before long they thought they all would be able to move back home. And of course, there was always the river. One Saturday morning, Francis woke up before anyone else at the farm, and he thought, if I hurry, I can get down to the river, have some time there, and get back before anybody else is even awake. So off he went. He went to one of the favorite spots there at the river. There was an old weeping willow tree that kind of branches came down over the edge of the river bank. And Francis sat there for a while and he just watched what was going on. He didn't really see much. But then, all of a sudden, he saw a magnificent white swan come floating down the river. Francis laid down flat on the grass and tried to hide among the tall grass because Chris and Martin, the Glenny boys, they had seen that swan and they were sure she had a nest somewhere, but they hadn't been able to find the nest. So Francis got very low and quiet and still, and he watched. And he watched the swan coming closer and closer to the bank where he was laying. And Francis looked over into the tall grass. And there it was. There was her nest with 4 beautiful swan's eggs in that nest. He was so excited. He thought, I found the nest. I'm going to run back to the farm and tell Chris and Martin. And then he thought, and they're not going to believe me. And they're going to think I'm lying. Ah, he had an idea. If he took one of those eggs out of that nest and he took that back to the farm, they'd have to believe him. Now, Francis knew that at the farm it would be considered quite a crime to steal an egg out of some bird's nest. But he thought, but they'll believe me if I take this. I really want that egg. And so Francis reached his hand out to that nest. And suddenly he stopped. What was this? Suddenly he was filled with knowing that this would be wrong, and with kind of thinking he didn't really want to do it. Francis had never felt this before. Always before, when he wanted to do something, he did it. He really didn't even think about whether it was right or wrong, and even if he did think it was wrong, well, he didn't really care. But this time he did. He cared, and he stopped, and he thought, maybe this is Jesus. Maybe this is those clean springs of goodness and love and joy. Maybe this is the way he's going to speak to me, and maybe if I keep on listening, he'll keep on filling me up with those good things. Francis jumped up, leaving the egg there. He started to run back to the farm. And somehow he knew that Jesus had come in and had given him this new life and these springs of goodness and love and joy. And they had started to flow from Jesus to him, and they were going to be flowing out to other people now too. So that's the end of our story. Thank you for listening to it. It's a good one, Where the River Begins. And you know, guys, I am so glad that when I was just a little girl, I understood that I had done wrong things. And I was filled up with those muddy waters. And it was hard. I also came to know and believe that Jesus had taken care of all that hard, bad, muddy stuff for me. He had died for me, and he'd come alive again, and he could forgive and give me those clean springs of water. And he did that, and it's been over 50 years since I started to know Jesus and came to believe in him, and he's never left. And every time, I'm not perfect, don't always do what's right, but every time, if I go to Jesus, he gives me that goodness and joy. Don't forget, I love you, Jesus loves you, and I'm really hoping I can see you soon.